Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Kent. I'm the Director of Education for the National Atomic Testing Museum. On behalf of the museum staff and the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation, I would like to welcome you all to today's special lecture featuring Jeanne Sharp Howerton. During her presentation, Jeanne will be sharing her firsthand experiences growing up on the Blue Eagle Ranch, which sat at the edge of the Nevada Test Site during the years of atomic testing. Jeanne will be happy to answer audience questions following her talk. So if you do have a question for her, please hold it until the end and wait for a staff member to bring you the microphone. This will allow everyone attending remotely to hear your question. And then for those of you who are watching remotely, please write your questions into the Zoom chat box and we'll be sure to ask Jeanne the question for you. It is now my pleasure to introduce you all to Jeanne Sharp Howerton. Jeanne is a fourth generation Nevadan, and as a historian, author, and photographer, Jeanne has published 6 books on the history of ranching and mining camps in Eastern Nye County. For 30 years, she taught in the Clark County School District's program for gifted students. And after retiring, she began writing full-time and giving talks about local history. Please join me in welcoming Jeanne Sharp Howerton.
Alex, am I on? Okay. Hi, and thank you for coming. And I'm going to tell you the secrets of my past. Not many people know these things. So can you hear me? Okay, because it feels like it's a little low to me too. Is that better? I can talk into this if you want. So let's begin. Change the slide. Do you want to turn the lights down a little bit? Just a minute, I'm having technical difficulties. Okay, let's see. Okay. My name is Jeanne Sharp Howerton, and I am a downwinder. I didn't know I was that when I was growing up. We were just people living our lives on the ranch, and other people would set off bombs, and sometimes the clouds would drift over our heads, and we'd have to go and hide in the house. And they told us it was all safe. Okay. We have to get this together when we want to do it. The Blue Eagle Ranch was settled in 1868. At the same time, they found some mines in the area and a lot of settlement took place. It started as a freight station by a big spring that produced a lot of water, and the freighters could use the meadows of grass as they came through. It was a good place to have a ranch, and we really, really liked it. But it was located about 100 miles due north from the test site. So there's our ranch, and it's a straight up railroad valley from the test site. Okay. Our ranch was, next slide. Our ranch was very isolated. We had no phones, no TV, no running water, no indoor plumbing, no neighbors other than our cousins 3 miles away. But at the same time, it was really a wonderful place to grow up. We didn't mind that we were isolated like that because we didn't know anything else. So we did a lot of work. When the wind didn't blow and the windmill wouldn't pump, then we had to pump water to water our garden. And we kept all the animals, we fed them, milked the cows, and rode horses, drove cows up into the mountains, spent hours in the hayfield haying as we kids do. And I loved all of it. I really, really liked growing up on the ranch. Okay, next slide. So in 1950, 3 little girls, this is my sister Carol, my oldest sister Carol, my sister Helene and me. Carol's 7, Helene's 1, and I am 3. And we were the 3 little girls on the Blue Eagle Ranch. So Then, next slide. January 27th, 1951, just 7 days after I turned 4 years old. On that day, the first atomic bomb was detonated on the test site. And it was Operation Ranger, and being the first in the series, they named it Able. And they named a lot of them Able, just using that vernacular. I don't remember it going off. Next slide. People ask when I talk to them about the bombs, if it was scary and if it was, if we were worried about it and everything. And I want to give you a little analogy, a story about the frog. If you put a pot of boiling water on the stove and you put a frog into it, he'll jump out because he's, doesn't want to die. But if you put the pot of water on the stove and it's cold and you heat it up, the frog will stay in the water and cook because he doesn't notice that something's happening. So that's kind of like we were. We didn't know anything else. They set off bombs, and they had set off bombs my whole life and all of our whole life. So it wasn't scary. It just was what we grew up with. We really didn't know anything else. I think the adults were more worried about it, but they didn't really share that concern with us. So for us, it didn't seem that unusual. Next slide. So when they would set off the tests, they would set them off early in the morning before sunup, because that's when the wind would be the most stable and they could predict better where the bomb clouds would go, and it was just better atmospheric conditions. So they announced the tests. They didn't announce all of them, but they did the big ones. And so then when we knew that there was going to be a bomb going off, we would get up early in the morning, walk out the front door of the house, stand on the road, and look straight down the valley. And that was where the detonations would occur, just straight down the valley. And we would wait for the flash. Okay. Next slide. And the flash would light up the whole southern sky. Sometimes it was brilliant white, sometimes it was kind of more pink. But it was quite beautiful. It was just this huge flash, and everything was real silent. It was like there were no birds. It was like totally silent. So next slide. So then we would go back to bed, because this is the sequence of events. They have the flash, and then about 10 minutes later, the sound wave would hit the house. It took about 10 minutes to come the 100 miles. And then we could feel the house, the beds shake, the old house rattled. And then by the time we got up to do chores a couple of hours later, then the atomic mushroom cloud would be up in the sky. And we watched it to see if it was going to come up over us or if it was going to go over to Utah. Get those folks. Next slide. So the mushroom cloud, when it came up the valley, you can see that the sky is blue. This is all atomic mushroom cloud coming up over us. So we got a lot of fallout. And you notice how it kind of hugs the mountains. You can see how it especially kind of goes in through here. And this becomes important a little bit later in the talk. So this is what we saw. Now, they didn't all come over us, maybe about half of them. Some were bigger, some were smaller. There was a lot of variation. They got bigger as they went along. Now, next slide. Our house, we were isolated, but the world seemed to come to us. A lot of people were interested in Railroad Valley. We had geologists all over the place. They were young men women getting their masters and PhDs. They would come out and look at our mountains because they were pretty cool. And they discovered oil in 1954, so there were always a lot of cars there. Limnologists came out because we had all these hot springs and cold springs, and sometimes in very close proximity to each other. And ichthyologists would come out and look at the endemic fish, because about every single spring had a fish that was endemic to that one little place where it got trapped after all the water dried up and they got isolated in their springs. Entomologists were collecting bugs. We would collect them for the university. Ornithologists would look at the birds. The botanists, we had endemic plants. And we had lots of military action. The jets from Nellis would fly and buzz the ranch. And sometimes they'd be so low, you could literally look out and look into the cockpit and see them. And they kind of harassed us some too, but we thought it was fun. We liked it. And then there were the secret aircraft. They did the X-15 over our valley, the Regulus II missile. They had a station where they were tracking the Regulus II missile. And the spy planes that came off of Area 51, we weren't really aware of them, but they did go over our big valley. So a lot of activity. Even in 1908, they ran the Great New York to Paris. Remember, around the world in a motor car, the Great New York to Paris race came right down through our ranch in 1908. And of course, there were miners. And then when I was little, they were still mining gold and silver and tungsten. So the place was actually pretty active, and a lot of stuff was going on in it. Okay, next slide. So the second year of testing, 1952, they had cute little names for the tests, like this one is Operation Tumbler Snapper. And they did 8 tests, and they would either drop them from an airplane or they would set them on towers. Apparently for this group of tests, they were trying to decide an optimal level to set them off the ground. You don't blow them up on the ground. You put them into the air. And so if they're on a tower, I think this picture shows, probably hard to see, but it shows an actual tower. And so when this high-speed photography could catch, this is the moment the bomb is just detonating and before it has actually flashed and done all its stuff. So they were doing things to see how far up above the ground they should set them. And the other thing was they would put them on towers, and then when the bomb exploded, they would have men in trenches, and then they would get up and have to move toward the bombs, which is a little horrifying to think about. But this is what they were doing, folks. So you probably know this too. So another thing that happened in 1952, next slide, is our fourth sister, Linda, was born in August of that year. So in 52, she got the radiation from when she was, gestational, got the radiation from that group of bombs. But we did a lot of things for fun because we were so isolated. We had to make up our own games. We did, we played games probably a lot of you played when we were little, and we'd get together with the neighbors occasionally and we'd dance and we'd sing, and when we weren't working, we kept ourselves busy. So we didn't focus on the bombs. They happened, but it's not like we were, obsessed with them or anything. Okay, let's do the next slide. So the 1953 series had some extremely, what we call dirty bombs, very, very high radiation levels. And the first one was March 24th. It was called Nancy. And when it was detonated, it moved up into Sand Spring Valley. And there was a band of sheep that were leaving their winter range in March, and they were driving them to Utah, to Cedar City, to lamb them. And this bomb swept right over the top of them, and they were heavily, heavily irradiated. And by the time they got the sheep to Utah, they were dropping lambs that were so incredibly deformed. And if you know about lambing, a mother sheep is very protective of the baby when it's born, and she'll butt you. And so when the babies would be born, the mother would just get up and just walk away and leave them. And when they got to Utah and the lambs were born, they were horribly deformed, and most of them died. And the sheep, their wool just came off in bunches, and it was awful. So of course the sheep owner tried to get compensation and contacted the government in lawsuits and all of this. And their at the end of it, the official announcement was, well, they were just malnourished. There wasn't much to eat in those. So that ended that. So the next bomb, next slide. Dirty Harry, it also was in May 1953, and it went straight up to St. George and irradiated that area very heavily. it was so bad that when cars were coming from the east into Las Vegas, they would wash them in Moab, wash off the radiation to so it wouldn't get all that contamination in. And there was one story that they were washing these cars and all this water was running into the ditch, and there was a little Paiute boy playing in the water in the ditch, and nobody seemed to notice. So, there were stories that things that did happen. Okay, let's move on to the next year, 1955. This was really a kind of a pivotal year in our family and in many, many ways. The first thing was people were beginning to be upset about what was happening. So the response was they published a brochure. And you can see it's January 1955. And it was to teach us about the bombs and that they really were safe. But they were also to tell us how we could keep ourselves safe from the bombs. Next slide. So we learned how to protect ourselves from fallout. Don't drink ranch milk. The cows would graze on the grass that radiation had fallen on, and strontium-90 and iodine would get into their milk. And then if you drank the milk, that would be deposited in your body. So don't drink the ranch milk. Wash your vegetables, hide in the house when the bomb cloud comes over, and wear your film badge if you're wearing a film badge. So these were some of the things we had to do. Not drinking our milk was almost impossible because there were no stores. I mean, we had the cows, so sometimes we wouldn't drink it. Next slide. But we did learn big words like iodine 131, strontium 90. We girls knew about those, and we knew that we weren't supposed to be drinking the milk. And it's funny, we did have to drink some. And my littlest sister, my youngest sister, who isn't born yet in the story, she when she had her first child, about 25 years later, she was nursing the baby, and it was a failure to thrive. So they took her milk and they analyzed it to see why the baby wasn't doing better. And they said, do you know that your milk has a lot of iodine and strontium 90 in it? So 25 years later, that would be like a half-life for strontium. It was in us. Okay, so the next big thing that happened in 1955 was we got a real school. And having this real school ended up being beneficial to us later on in life. Before in 1955, all of the schools in Nevada, each school was its own little district. It'd be like the Blue Eagle School District, the Willow Creek School District. In 1955, they took all the districts and made each county its own district, so that every county was a district, and we were in the Nye County School District. And so the little building that we had was, did you not change slides? There we go. Okay. So when we got to school, you have to get a school, you have to have 5 students of school age. And once you have the school started, you can have 3 kids to take it. So in our school, Carol is in 8th grade, and Joe's in 7th, and I'm in 5th grade, and Earl's in 3rd. And then the little 2 girls, when they got into 1st grade, then we had 6 kids and we could start a school. And Linda was in school too, even though she was only 3 years old. But it was fun to have a school. So next slide. Another thing happened in 1955. Butch Bertoli came down with leukemia. Next slide. Butch Bertoli lived on the prettiest ranch in Railroad Valley. It was 25 miles south of our ranch, so he was 25 miles closer to the test site, but it also was up in the hills. And remember how I said that fallout would kind of hug the hills as it went along? And so their family and our family were kind of like mirrors of each other. Carol and Beverly were the same age. I was the same age as Jackie. Helene was the same age as Butch. And Butch came home one day from school and told his mom, I found the girl I'm going to marry. I'm going to marry Jeanne Sharp. And he kept saying that. That's my sister. And then he came down with leukemia. So next slide. The ranch was the same age as ours, settled in the 1860s. And the father, Martin Bertoli, died in 1905 and is buried on top of the hill. His grandson was named Martin Bertoli after him, but everybody called him Butch. Okay, next slide. So the Twin Springs had a school also. And you can see they have kind of the same kind of a line of a few more kids. They were all cousins going to school in Twin Springs, which is 50 miles south of our ranch. It's about halfway to the test site. And so Butch Bertoli was age 6, and here he is. So next slide. So he came home from school one day not feeling good. He had a fever and didn't feel good and never got any better. And then he was diagnosed with leukemia. So in the summer of 1956, he was very, very sick. So we went to visit. My mom took us girls in the car and we went down to visit them in the ranch. And I remember 2 things. My mom and Martha Bertoli, Butch's mother, they stayed in the house and talked, but I could feel that something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. But we kids all went outside to play. And Butch Bertoli had this really cool grater. And we girls didn't have things like that. And it was a really fun thing. And it had an adjustable blade to the bottom. You could turn it. And Butch played with this grater all the time in the dirt, making roads. And we girls played with him in the dirt. And it wasn't until later on that I began to realize that one of the things they said about if you are going to get exposed to radiation is the amount of time you spend outside in thing. And here was little Butch playing with his grater in the dust, in the dirt. And so that was one of the clear memories. And the other one was when we left and went home, I asked my mom why he was so fat, because apparently the leukemia had made him bloat up. So those are my 2 memories. And he died in October of 1956. Next slide. So that was kind of a turning point, at least in our part of the world. People were scared and they were mad. And so Martha Bertoli, his mother, got very proactive and she started a petition and she sent it to Congress begging for people to stop the testing. And she got a couple of responses that weren't quite what she'd hoped for. Nevada Senator Malone alluded to the fact that, fallout from testing might have detrimental effects on human health. But then he mentioned that the scare stories about fallout just might be a communist-inspired plot. So that didn't do anything to help the public relations. So the Bertoli family in 1958, they sold their ranch and they moved to Carson City. And the father, Jack Bertoli, died 2 years later from cancer. Next slide. Unfortunately, the family sold their ranch to the most notorious cattling rustling family in the state of Nevada. The 2 worst words you could say in Nevada was John Casey. And he had this cattle rustling ring operating all over the state. And they bought this ranch, and for 12 years, they rustled cattle from our neighborhood. We didn't get as many rustled because that wasn't quite our range, but they sure got my cousin's cattle, probably 1,200, maybe 2,000 cattle over 12 years. It was an interesting operation. They would go out in the range and they would take cows and calves and bring them back to their ranch. Then they would take the calves who wouldn't be branded. They'd load them in a truck. They'd take them into White River Valley, brand them for themselves, and then raise them and sell them. The cows, they would kill the cows and they would feed them to pigs. So they were fattening the pigs on the cows, and then they would burn the hides and burn the bones in these burn pits. So it took a long time for them to finally crack the case and get them to trial and get them out of the valley. And then my cousins bought the ranch so that the cattle rustling has stopped. So next slide. So 1957, another kind of a pivotal year. This was the year I started keeping a diary. My dad kept a diary, and I always wanted to be like my dad. So I announced to the family I wanted to keep a diary. So for Christmas, I got this, it was a notebook, 25 cents. And so January 1st, I started keeping a diary. And I kept it every single day, and I recorded things. And it turned out that 1957 was a pretty interesting year for keeping a diary. We went outside to watch Sputnik go over. Remember when Sputnik went? And I wrote in my diary, the second Sputnik, remember, had the dog in it. Do you remember the name of the dog? Anybody say it? So anyway, the dog, everybody thought Laika. But in my diary, I wrote down, Curly has to die. Curly is going to die. And I thought, Curly? But Curly wasn't the dog's name. The dog was Laika. I've always known the dog was Laika. But when I looked back in, when I did some research, they had named the dog a Russian name that meant Curly, but Americans couldn't pronounce it. So they wouldn't use it. They just called the dog Curly. And the Russians didn't like that. So the Russians changed the dog's name and called the dog Laika, which means barking dog. And then people could say that. So my diary recorded something that most people, including me, had forgotten. Okay, the other thing that happened in 1957 was Operation Plum Bob. And this was a series of tests that they were supposed to test the effects of bombs on structures. You know, they'd make houses and fill them with people, mannequins and stuff. And on animals, they'd put animals in cages and see what the effect of it was. And on people too, I guess. We were part of the experiment. We just didn't realize how much. Oh, I still have mine down here. Thank you. I think I will. So the Operation Plum Bob had 29 tests. Next slide. Detonated over about 4 months. And you can see they were just doing one after another. And on September 8th, they set off a test, Laplace. And the reason that is marked on there is because that was the day that my youngest sister, Marilyn, was born. And next slide. So now our family has the 5 girls that we had. So in Marilyn's birth, when I kept my diary, when I left home, I left my diaries at the ranch. And they just sat there. So 49 years later, after I'd written it, my mother had had a knee replaced. So I went up to the ranch and lived for 3 months and to take care of her. And so I had time. So I was going through my stuff and I found the diary. And I started to read it and I thought, oh my gosh, this is the story that all of my sisters need to remember, because it's the story of not only me, but all of my family and my cousins and anybody that lived on a ranch. So I thought, I think because 2007, it's going to be 50 years, I'm going to turn it into a book. So I typed it all out and I made it into a book. But I thought it's going to be so much fun for Marilyn to see what I wrote on the day she was born. So I go to September the 8th and I didn't write anything. And I didn't write anything on the 9th. And I didn't write anything on the 10th. And finally on the 11th, I said, we have a new baby sister. Her name is Marilyn. And we all 3 of us had red hair. And she said she has brown hair. So I thought, well, this is strange. Well, then I had my father's diaries. My mom had given me my father's diary. So I went to see what he said about Marilyn's birth. Well, he'd taken my mom into Ely and left her to have the baby on the 7th. Well, the very next morning she'd had the baby. But we had no telephones. We had no way of knowing. So my mom wrote my dad a letter, put it in the mail. We got our mail 2 days a week on Mondays and Fridays. And so the next mail day on Friday, he got the letter saying that she had the baby. So that was how that turned out. Okay, next slide. So they kept doing bigger and bigger bombs on the test site. And the biggest bomb they ever did atmospherically was one called Hood. And it was a hydrogen bomb. And they were not supposed to do hydrogen bombs. That was something they were not going to do on Nevada test site. So, but we knew that something was happening because there were a lot of cars coming out. They brought us new film badges and they told us, this is going to go off. They warned us. So we got up in the morning and to watch it. And next slide, when we lived on a road, and the road in that time went right through our ranch. So we knew any cars that came by, and if they were family, they'd always stop. But we got a lot of cars before this test, and we wondered what they were. So we girls would run up to the top of the hill. We just leave and run up the top of the hill, and we could see where the cars went. Were they going to the oil wells? Were they going up to a mine? What were they doing? So that was our connection to the outside world. But no, it was this test. Next slide. So we got up early in the morning. We watched the flash. We felt the shock wave, which was probably the biggest shock wave we ever felt. And it was a hydrogen bomb. So that was the story there. Now, to be fair, next slide, bombs weren't the only hazards that we faced growing up on the ranch. And one of the days that stands out in my early childhood in 1957 was the day I was chased by a bull. And this is how it happened. Next slide. So the ranch, when it was built in 1868, was built down here by the water. But when my grandmother came to the ranch in 1900, she didn't want to live in that old house. It was down there with the mosquitoes and so my grandfather built her a new ranch right here at the contact of the gravel and the meadow. So we had our ranch here from 1900 and the one over here from 1868. So my dad and I went out to feed some calves across the field. So we walk across the field and we feed the calves, and we're coming back, and the sun's down, it's getting kind of dark. And as we're walking up, this bull is standing in the field. And he was a gentle bull. We'd been around him, always feeding him. And my dad said, something's wrong because he hasn't been coming up to eat. So when he walked up to the bull, he kind of said, shoo. And usually they just turn around and run. But he didn't. He lowered his head and he charged. So we both turned around and started to run. Well, I'm only 9 years old, and so my dad can run faster. So the bull is chasing me, and all I can think is I have to be able to get and jump over this stockade fence, but I knew right where the little hole was, I could get over it. But my dad could see I was never going to make it. So he ran back and yelled at the bull, and the bull chased him, and they made this big wide circle clear out in the field, and my dad outran the bull. And the bull, who was sick, left him, just stopped running, and then I was able to sneak across the field. So you see, there are some other things besides bombs to worry about. Next slide. Okay, we were beginning to notice that the things that we were told by the monitors, we were monitored by people, and then we were monitored by machines too, to see how much fallout we were getting. And so at the Fellini Ranch, Twin Springs, Joe Fellini bought a Geiger counter, because when they would come out with Geiger counters after a bomb would go off, and he'd say, how was it? And they'd say, well, not much there. Then Joe would go get his Geiger counter. And of course, it would be really, really different from theirs. So we knew then, and some other ranchers did the same thing. They got Geiger counters to track. So they tracked this is an air filtering device where they would run the air through a filter, and then every day my sister had to take the filters out and mail them in. And these are the film badges that we wore to monitor how much radiation we were getting. But they also had people who were monitoring us too, the ones who were checking on us. And so the three that came out to our railroad valley were Don James and Ken Giles and Chuck Costa. And probably a bunch of you may have known them. And they would gather our milk, and they'd take samples of grass and vegetables, and then they would take stuff back and tell us not to drink milk. But they were really, I realize now, they were PR people. They were very personal. They, everybody just really liked them. They were so nice and so kind, and well, they were handsome, and we girls were starting to notice that some guys were handsome, and so they were a really good PR for us. But my sister Carol started to notice something, because Chuck Costa became ours. She said, you know what I noticed? She said, Chuck Costa will never eat or drink anything at all that I go to give him. So, because my sister, She raised a garden. She loved to cook. She loved to feed you. And she would always try to get him to stay for lunch. Look, I baked some cookies and, oh gosh, I just had something in the car. So then we started to really notice, and it was true. He never ate or drank anything. So I thought that sounded suspicious. So the next slide. So the fix to people getting more alarmed was to make a new booklet. And this one done in 1957, it's a little booklet given to school kids, and we all got these little booklets. And I can remember my dad laughing at this picture of blast claims because I don't know of anybody that ever got any compensation for blast claims. We had our well cave in during one of the underground tests, and but that's not something that they really did, was compensate anybody that I knew about. Okay, next one. So July 6th, 1962 was a big shot called the Sedan shot, and I know a bunch of you will know about that one. Next slide. It was part of what they called the Plowshare Program. It was peaceful. It was to do excavations quickly, so they could, excavate out a canal, and so they would. I don't know why they didn't think about the radiation, but this is what they were going to do. So they were going to set off this bomb, and it was going to do this excavation just instantly. So next slide. So this is when we got our new monitor, Chuck Costa. And if you want to know why I have all those dates exactly, because I wrote it in my diary. So he came to meet us on June the 13th, 1962. He was fresh out of college from Boston, never been out to Nevada before, newly hired, and he was going to be our monitor. So on July 4th, he came out and brought us new film badges. And then on July 6th, he came out to monitor the Sedan shot. Well, our parents were going to Elko for a meeting that day. So we 5 girls are in the house. Carol's 18 and Marilyn's 5, so then the others are in between. Next slide. So the bomb was detonated 635 feet underground. And these pictures are amazing. You can see how the ground starts to come up and then starts to break. Next slide. And then just kaboom. Next slide. And all that dust came straight up Railroad Valley. Joe Fellini down at the Twin Springs Ranch took a couple of pictures of the cloud descending on his ranch. He'd try to take pictures sometimes, and the film would be just exposed. He couldn't get pictures. So somebody said, take that film, put it in a lead box and put it in your freezer. So when he took pictures of the Sedan shot, that's exactly what he did. He put the film in the freezer in a lead box, and then he was able to get, because this was a very, very dirty bomb. Next slide. So it came up the valley closer and closer, and we were watching it, and Chuck was out on the road watching the cloud come up, and we girls were playing around in and out of the house. And then as it got closer, we couldn't see the sandhills anymore. Then we couldn't see the end of the fence, and Chuck said, go in the house, which was what we always did. We'd run in the house when the clouds came over. So we went into the house, cloud came closer, next slide. And it started to get so dark that the chickens thought night had fallen, and they all went into bed. They went into the hen house to go to bed. And all of a sudden, Chuck burst into the house yelling, close the doors and close the windows. It's July, it's hot. And we sat in the house, and next slide. And the cloud is coming. And so we were in the house running from window to window, and I can't see the clothesline, I can't see the tank, I can't see the windmill. And we sat in the house until that cloud went over. And our parents were coming home from Elko that evening, and they ran into this odd cloud of dust above Ely, about at Logie Station. And they had no idea what this odd cloud of dust was, but this thing went and scattered radiation everywhere. And let's see how the excavation turned out. Next slide. Oh, made a big hole. 1,280 feet across, 320 feet deep, 11 million tons of earth displaced, and exposed more than 13 million people to high radiation. Have any of you gone out to see the crater? Raise your hand if you've gone to see the crater. Yeah, it's very, very dramatic. And it did make a big thing. Okay, next slide. But then atmospheric testing was stopped. They, on August the 5th, 1963, they did a limited test ban treaty. You could still test, but nothing in the atmosphere. But they'd done 100 tests already. And so they probably got a lot of their information. Next slide. So the testing was moved underground, and you get these craterings. They would make the sedan shot was purposefully placed not very deep, so it would blow out a big hole. The others would be set 1,000 feet down into the earth. And so when they would set them off, then it would vaporize everything under in that part where the bomb was, create a vacuum, and then not immediately, but eventually it would collapse, and you would get these pockets, these craters from doing the underground. Subsidence craters is what they called them. So then with testing moved underground, we just simply got a different set of problems. So by this time, it was 1969, I'd grown up, gotten married, moved to Las Vegas, and they were testing underground a lot and big, and they just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I had a secret little monitor in my house that let me know when the bombs went off and how big they were. It was called my grandfather clock. When a bomb would go off, if it was just a little bomb, I could just hear the weights in the clock just sort of shaking a little bit. And then I'd look up at my chandelier, and yep, that was a bomb. And then when they were bigger, it would the weights would stop the pendulum from swinging. And then when one time we had a really big one, it actually blew the door open on the clock. And as they kept getting bigger and bigger, Howard Hughes was buying up Las Vegas then, buying hotels. And he wasn't very happy because he thought it was going to hurt tourism if all these bombs kept going off. And you couldn't be on high rise when they had a big test. They would have to get everybody off the high rises, and construction workers had to come down. So he was pushing to take testing off the test site and do a remote testing. So they chose a place, here's our ranch, they chose a place 1 mountain range over in Hot Creek Valley, and they were going to make a new test site out there. Next slide. And it was called the Central Nevada Test Area. And there were some really nice old homes. In Hot Creek, there was this beautiful old house that would have been a hotel. And so they came out and they took off all the chimneys. There were 7 brick chimneys. They took them off and they crated them, and then just put stovepipes in and moved them off to the side. And they sat there for, gosh, about 50 years before they put them back on again. And then there was another house at Moore Station. And what they did with this house, they put a big beam across the front and another one on the back, and they ran rods through the house to kind of bolt it together. And so they could withstand the blast. They didn't know what was going to happen when they tested up there. Next slide. So the bomb was called Project Faultless, went off January 19th, 1968. And this is where the bomb actually, this is the casing that they drilled. This was level with the ground when they put the bomb down and blew it. And then the subsidence crater, you can see how much it must be, what, Charlie, about 10 feet high? It's really tall. It's quite a lot taller than a person. That's how much the subsidence crater was. But there was more. If you look in the distance, you can see a little line right here. And now we look over here. It actually dropped the whole valley. It caused a huge earthquake, and it made a big fault. And I love that they called it Project Faultless, because instead of making no fault, it actually dropped the whole valley, and they knew they could not do any more. The test was 1 megaton, the biggest test they'd ever done. And they had a 2 megaton bomb sitting in another drill hole that they were supposed to set off the next day, but they had to pull that one. And they had a third hole ready and a fourth one on the way. So they pulled those tests and they took them up to Alaska. The biggest one was a 5 megaton bomb, which they set off in Alaska. And then the test site, Central Nevada test site, is now, it's a base, it's a base that they use for Nellis military stuff. Okay, next one. So underground testing was not perfect. It would vent. And venting means that it would break through and the atomic cloud would still come up and get you. So one of the worst ventings happened in December 18th, 1970. And again, they named it the Baneberry test. And if you know, a baneberry is a plant that produces a very poisonous berry. And it was the end of the year. They wanted to try to get one more test in before the year ran out and their money ran out. So when they were drilling the hole, they had so much trouble with it. They couldn't keep it. It kept caving in, and they were drilling it right next to an earthquake fault. And so, but they did it and they drilled it, and they were supposed to evacuate everybody off the test site when they set it off. That was the protocol, but they didn't. And it vented with a might that you could not believe. And there were lots and lots of people right in the way of the cloud. And these two men, especially one man, he ran to try to get people evacuated. And he was in the cloud for 8 hours trying to get people out. And when he went finally to the monitors, and they said the reading on him was so high, they said, there's got to be something wrong with our counters because you can't possibly have that much exposure. But he did, and he got leukemia, and he died, and the other man with him died too. And so, but this one, they tried to litigate. They thought they had a perfect case. They had done everything wrong. They drilled it next to an earthquake fault. They hadn't evacuated. And so it was in litigation, and they had all these witnesses. Everybody said, he'll get the money. No, it was one judge made the ruling. And apparently he was influenced. And he said, no, because the government was not about to let people start suing and getting money because they realized it would just be out of control. If everybody who had a claim, they just wouldn't do it. But they did some other things. Next slide. They were monitoring people. They had at UNLV on the campus, they had a whole body count machine, and they would put you into this little tray and slide you into this cylinder, and then they would seal you in there, and they would count how much stuff was coming off your body. And so they wanted anybody on the ranch. So my mom went down, and my little sister Marilyn, and Carol and Carl, but my mom wouldn't do it. She said, no, I'm not going in there. And Marilyn, they sedated her so she could go into the machine, and so they got a count on her. And then Carol and Carl would go, I think once a year, once every 6 months, they would go down and have their body counts. I never went into the machine, but apparently it was very claustrophobic. Next slide. So the youngest person ever to go into the machine was Jackie Hanks. And according to the picture here, you can see she was 4 years old. Correct. This is my niece, my sister Carol's daughter. And so they were going to put her into the body count machine. And so Jackie went about 4 years ago. Jackie came to Las Vegas, and she thought, I want to go back to that lab, and I want to see, if it's still there, because she had some bad feelings about it. So she went to the UNLV, and there it was. Not only that, her picture was hanging on the bulletin board after 54 years. And so they gave her the picture. And so I said to her, can you send me the picture? Because I want to use it for my talk. And can you tell me a little bit about what you remembered about having your body count? And she said she was really, really scared. She was scared to go into the machine. And her dad said, all you have to do is just go there and just hold real still, don't wiggle, and you'll be okay. And he had her hand, she said, and he walked around the plastic table and he asked me if I thought I could do it. And I said, why do I have to? And he said, it's for the good of all the other people. So she went into the machine and she had the count. And when she came out, not too long afterwards, Joe Fellini's father died. And they were all, these families were really, really good friends. And when he died, Jackie told me, she said, when old Joe Fellini died, she said, I was sure it was because I wiggled on the plastic table. So she thought she was responsible for his death. And she just told me this just a week ago. So that was the body count machine. Okay, next picture. So finally, they halted all nuclear testing and signed the treaty in October 1992. And the last test was on the 23rd of October. But they had another test that was all ready to go. It was called Ice Cap. And so you had all the cables attached, and the bomb would be in here, and they would lower it into the ground. And everything just stopped. So they left everything as it was. And so if you go out and you can see this, it's pretty interesting to see all the stuff that goes into setting off a bomb. It is extremely complicated. So next slide, but this isn't really the end of the story. The CDC estimates about 11,000 cancer deaths in Nevada resulting from testing. Other studies would put it as high as 145,000. So you can see why they didn't want to litigate anything. Next slide. So besides downwinders, which we became known as, military personnel, they had these guys in the trenches and running with no protection, running toward these bombs. And so there was a lot of military personnel that got any test site worker. And then uranium workers, they were coming down with a lot of cancers. So they knew they had to do something. So next slide. This to me is one of the strangest stories. This happened July 19th, 1957 in my diary. I wrote down, we watched a rocket go off. It was a bomb. We saw the cloud. And I thought, really, a rocket? How did you write that down? But it was a rocket. They took these 5, they were going to prove how safe this was. So they took these 5 men and they put them underneath where a bomb was going to go off. And you can see they're just in their khakis and they have no protection whatsoever. And they're going to make a film of this to show. And actually, I found the film. It's online if you want to look at it. And they had I guess they had things suspended, the bomb, and they shot a rocket at it. And when the rocket hit the bomb up in the air and it blasted, then they said, see, nothing happened to these guys. It was totally safe. So if you want to watch this, you can, if you look up July 19th, 1957, you can see what happened. That would be the Plum Bob group. Okay, next slide. But there was other evidence too that the bombs had done a lot of damage. And one of them were horses got beta burns. When you set off the bomb, a lot of them are on towers. And the towers are high and they set them off. And when that bomb explodes, it vaporizes that tower. And then when it blasts, it sucks everything in. The mushroom cloud is a result of the sucking of the dirt up into the area. And that's what gets the radiation on the dirt, and then it falls on you. So, but little pieces of that tower would get into the cloud and then they'd fall out. So if you were pretty close, these were horses on the groom at the groom mine, which was only about 20 miles off the test site. And so these pieces would fall on their backs and they would get beta burns. And we didn't ever get any beta burns, but we had a lot of cows that had cancers in their eyes as they were grazing in, eating the vegetation. All of that radiation would get into their eyes. And here's one of the lambs that was formed. It has 7 legs, and it was just one of many, many things. And down by the Fellinis, they noticed that they had no birds and no jackrabbits. The wildlife was just pretty much gone. And the other odd thing was people kept finding uranium mines, they thought. They'd go out with their Geiger counters and, ooh, we think we got a uranium mine, we're gonna make a claim. But it was just radiation on the sagebrush and coming off of the ground. So next slide. So finally, they figured out they had to do something. So there was no way that they were gonna say that anything had harmed people from their tests. So what Congress did was it passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act in 1990. And what it did was it listed a certain number of cancers. And if you got that cancer, if you got these things, you didn't have to do anything but just put in for compensation. And downwinders could get $50,000. If you were an on-site worker like the military guys, they could get $75,000, and uranium workers could get $100,000. And so this is how they handle it. They just said it'll be cheaper just to pay it. We won't have to litigate. You just prove. There were two things you had to prove. You had to prove that you were there living in, if you're a downwinder, living in this area for 2 years, 2 consecutive years. You know, that's harder if you live on a ranch and there's nobody around. That's harder to prove than you would think. I thought, well, I could use my diaries because I kept them and I had them from 57 onward. But what they used was, because we had our school and because we had school records in Nye County School District, they could get those records and they would have our records of our, class attendance and stuff like that, and report cards and stuff. So this is supposed to sunset. Well, it's going to sunset in about 2 weeks. It was expanded in 2000, and they were going to sunset. It was supposed to go till 2024, and I guess the last Congress did not fund it. So now it's being cut back. So you only have a little while to get your claim in. Okay, so next slide. So these are the maps of who got compensation. The blue was downwinders, the yellow was uranium workers, and the green was a mix of uranium workers and downwinders. And you can see that not only are we here in the blue, but we're here in the blackest of the black. And here was our ranch right in the reddest of the red. So we were definitely in the hot spots. So I was talking, we went to a family reunion last weekend, and there was a family that lived up in Taibo, which was just 12 miles from that new test site that they'd made. And so I'm asking my cousin, I said, so, there were 7 kids. I said, is anybody still alive? And he said, no. He started naming what they died of, and 5 of the 7 kids had died of cancer. 1 child had died in infancy, and the other one died of I don't know what, but 5 out of 7 children. So, we never really talked about it. We never asked who got cancer, you did or you didn't, but we didn't know. Okay, next slide. So the test site is still functioning, but they're not doing active bombs, but they do what they call subcritical experiments. And Chuck Costa took me down into the U tunnels to see where they did these experiments, where they start the thing and they stop it right before it goes critical. And so far, I guess it's worked. I guess I got them stopped in time. And then, you can go see the houses that, they'll take tours, the houses that withstood the bombs, and you can go. I went to quite a few archaeological sites. But the most dramatic thing I went into was the Climax mine. It was an active mine, and then when the test site took over that area, they just expanded this mine, and they used it to test to see if they could store spent fuel. So they were these little canisters in the ground that hold rods from nuclear plants, and they would put them in there. And you get into a cage, a miner's cage, and you drop down 1,400 feet. And they drop the cage fast, and you're in this little thing, and the air is, you're going against the air, and so the cage is bouncing off the walls, and it was quite dramatic. But usually when you go down into the ground, it gets colder. when we went down in here, it got very, very warm. And apparently these spent fuel rods were actually heating up the earth. So it was kind of interesting. Next slide. So now the test site has been renamed. It's called the Nevada National Security Site. And the website says that they are keeping the national nuclear weapons stockpile safe. And they still use it for testing, and they probably do subcritical. So next slide. So let's see what happened to the little Sharp girls. Carol stayed on the ranch, and our father died in 1965. So she and her husband took over the ranch and did it until she died in 2020 in the COVID thing. And my little sister, Helene, she got breast cancer in 1996. And she was the first one to put in for the compensation. And she got it. And that's how we found out that you could get it through the school records. And I got cancer in 2012. And I got the $50,000. It made me feel better. So this is the story of growing up on the ranch. And so next slide. And then if you have some questions to ask, I think that Joe will help me.
Well, let me say that thank you for the best program that's ever been done in this theater. I'll tell you that. It was wonderful. I learned a lot. It was great. I'm curious about the history of the family in the area, if your family or the prior Tim were in this area, and then the genesis of how you left and where you went to school and how you got to where you are now.
Okay, I think, am I still live? Yeah, okay. So the family came to Nevada, my family came to Nevada in the 1860s. On my grandmother's line, they came to Belmont, first to the gold fields in California and then into Belmont. And then my grandfather's line, he came with the Mormons into Pahranagat Valley. And so then my grandfather went to Railroad Valley and bought this ranch that had been settled in 1868. And so and then he married my grandmother from Belmont. So that's how we got to be there. And growing up on the ranch, it worked pretty well in the early days. The first guy out, my grandfather, he had this ranch and he'd buy people out and he had all this land and he had 6 kids. And when he died, each kid got a piece of land. But then those kids get land. Those kids have kids. And you just can't keep subdividing forever because it just doesn't work. So a lot of people that you had to leave or wanted to leave. I didn't ever want to leave the ranch. I loved the ranch, but my sister was running the ranch because our father died. I always thought I would get it, but I didn't. So I came to Las Vegas and I was close enough. I could go back to the ranch all the time, which is what I did. So my sister Helene actually became a Catholic nun and she had spent time in Africa. And so she went around. My other 2 little sisters live in Reno, but you just can't keep subdividing. Did that answer your question?
You went to school and then college.
Oh yeah. On the ranch, we went to school through 8th grade, and then our options were to go to Ely and board in there, but my parents sent us to a Catholic boarding school in Salt Lake City. And the nuns got my sister. So that's where we went to high school. Then I went to school in Reno, graduated. And we all. Make you a Mormon, but evidently not. Well, I could have been a Mormon, except that my great grandfather, he was converted in England, but I don't think he really bought into the religion. He bought into the fact he could get free passage on that boat to America, and he came over. And then, so he came out to the West. And as soon as he got into Nevada, into the mines at Pahranagat, they just didn't do anything with the church at all. Number one, there wasn't a church, but so he wasn't strong at all. And what happened was, if you were a girl from that Sharp family and you married a Mormon boy, then those people became Mormons. But if you were a man and you married, like my grandfather married my Irish Catholic grandmother, we became Catholics. So no, but I have a ton of relatives in Pahranagat Valley that are Mormons. it was opportunistic. Yeah, we have a question over there.
So does your family still operate the ranch or?
We had to sell the ranch because my sister, my brother-in-law died, things just, she couldn't handle it. So she sold the ranch. But we have my mother's 5 acres in her house. So we still go
Okay,
up.
is it still an operating ranch?
It's still an operating ranch. Mhm. Yep, still running cattle.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My question is it possible to drive out into that area? Are there roads, like if, for example, if you went up US 93 and broke off somewhere, how would you get there? And are some of the roads paved or?
To our ranch?
Yes.
Well, we would drive up, mostly we go up through Alamo, up on 93 to Alamo. Then we take the 375 cutoff going toward Tonopah. And then there's a place where it heads west, and there's a sign that says Nyala Road, and we take 50 miles of dirt road up to our ranch.
Okay.
Mhm. And we drive it all the time. Road's good. Isn't it, Charlie?
We were up there just last week. It's the first time we'd been to Lund. We used to go through Lund all the time, and I worked for a period of time in Ely, back and forth every weekend through Lund. We haven't been through Lund until last weekend for probably 2 years, maybe 3, with going to the ranch.
Yeah, that ways only has 12 miles of dirt instead of 20, 50.
I wanted to make a little comment about the Faultless place. A few years ago, I can't remember how long ago it was, Jeanne and I were going up to a party someplace up there. And we came down this road and went across the hill up into the Faultless site. And it was kind of interesting because there are a lot of little flags that they're monitoring there. But there was one area that was chain link fenced. And on this, the signs on the fencing said, keep out.
It said petroleum impacted soils. Yeah, petroleum impacted soils.
And my guess is there's not one petroleum product in there, but I bet you there's a lot of Eon sites.
You mentioned now Railroad Valley. Where are the oil wells in Railroad Valley in relation to your ranch?
Right next to them. Right
Oh,
next
okay.
to them.
And
Yeah.
they're still operational, right? Some of them.
February the 12th, 1954, my dad comes into the door. He says, they struck oil. And I had no idea what he was talking about. But no, they actually had quite an oil thing out there. In the 1980s, they hit one well that was free flowing. It could free flow 5,000 barrels a day, but they could only haul out 4,500 barrels a day. They had 60 to 80 double, triple tanker trucks going up that dirt road, hauling oil to refineries all around. That's a whole nother, yeah. And they still have about 3 areas that they're pumping, and they're still out there looking for stuff. Mm-hmm. But then the well that was free flowing 4,500 barrels of oil, then started flowing 4,500 barrels of water. So I guess they sucked the oil off the top of the water, and that was the end of that.
Got 2 quick questions for you. The first one is, at the largest, how big was the ranch?
It's hard to say because it started off as, well, it was 6 homesteads. So that would be 160 times 6. So, and then they kept adding a little bit here and a ranch over there and a field over here. So I don't really know. And part of it was my cousins owned it. It wasn't a huge operation, but what you do is you run your cattle outside on the open range.
Right. The other question is, you're talking about life on the ranch. You said you didn't have TV. Did y'all have radio? And if you did, was it AM radio, shortwave radio, or?
Well, we had a radio. It would only work at night because we couldn't get any, and we had a pole and then this wire hooked up to a pole, and it ran on a car battery. But after about 4 o'clock in the evening, you could get radio. And so we would listen to Fibber McGee and Molly and, and the polka party. But we didn't have, I remember my dad trying to listen to the fights on New Year's Day, and it would be real staticky.
Was that mainly out of Las Vegas or some other city?
I know that the KFI Los Angeles was where we got our polka party from. Mhm. Yeah.
It was on 540 or something like that.
Yeah.
KFI.
KFI Los Angeles.
Los
Mhm.
Angeles.
That was the one we,
1,000-watt clear channel station forever and ever.
and that's what we got, was that one. Mhm.
Oh, where did, excuse me, where did you, well, thank you for coming. I really appreciate
Well,
you.
thank you.
Where did you do your shopping primarily? Like what stores, or did you go to Goldfield or Las Vegas or Ely or?
Well, we were 75 miles from Ely. So we usually went to Ely about once a month to get supplies. But we also went to Tonopah, which is 120 miles. But my grandmother lived in Tonopah, my dad's mother. And so he had bought the ranch from her. So we would go in there. But we did most of our shopping in Ely, and there was a Safeway store that we shopped at.
Yeah, I know there's not much out there. I worked around that area.
Yeah.
I remember Frank Costa very well. You saw something that reminded me of when I was watching your Baneberry slide.
Mhm.
I was in an experiment called, I think it was called Midas Myth, as I recall. And I was going in as a reentry to look for some stuff. I was a J6er, and the thing fell in on us.
Oh, no.
And what really reminded me at the time when we was falling and landing in the ditch, I heard this hissing sound, a tremendous hissing sound. And first thing went through my mind, oh God, another Baneberry. And we were laying here in the middle of it. And but of course it wasn't. It turned out it was a fire alarm, a fire system
Oh.
had escaped on the cave-in and broke a line. And that was the much like that was coming out.
So you knew about Baneberry.
Oh, yes, I
Were you,
worked
were
for
you,
Los
were you
Alamos.
exposed to Baneberry?
No,
area
actually,
12?
it was before my time, but everybody knew of Baneberry. I worked with one of the laboratories for years. That's how I do Costa and some of the others. And the radios, I did quite a few projects. I was wondering, I know about where your ranch was. I'd never been to it, but you were kind of at a right angle over toward Area 51 in that area from where you were, if you were coming straight toward the test site.
Yeah, we were just right up Railroad Valley. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
pretty much a straight shot. Yeah.
Well, they were very cavalier at one time. I
Yes.
worked in Los Alamos,
Mhm.
and the radiation situation was partly, I think, ignorance, partly we don't want to know, and various reasons.
Mhm.
But it was, I had an uncle that was in Nagasaki right after he was a Marine, and that's where they sent him. And he also got leukemia a very short time afterwards.
Mhm.
You know.
Do we have any more questions for Jeanne?
Thank you, Jeanne.
Thank you for coming and listening.
My question is, there's been a lot of articles written by the downwinders, about the downwinders, and about the people in Utah and St. George and all the people that died. And then there was the John Wayne movie that was filmed there, and a lot of those people died.
Oh, yes.
Of cancer.
Yes, Snow
And
Mountain.
the rebuttal to that one is all of the people in the movie who starred in it were very heavy smokers. And so the people say, well, that's why they died.
Yeah.
And then there was apparently a cafe nearby that they all went to, but nobody died there. That's what the owner said. Do you have an opinion about some of the things I mentioned about the people in Utah who died? You were a downwinder and you had people who knew people who died.
Yeah, that's the trouble, is you can't be definitive that yes, this cancer was caused by bombs. Otherwise, why doesn't everybody get it? Why is it just some people that get it? But when you look at the number of, I think St. George had a huge amount. Well, they had bigger population. And they got they got some of the dirtiest bombs. And so I'm very sure that it was caused by that. But you can't be positive about it. And yeah, I know about the story about when they were filming up there in Snow Canyon, and everybody that was connected with that movie ended up dying. But was it cancer from the bombs? Don't know. I've done a lot of reading about it. People asked if I am angry, and I'm really not. It's like just because I'm the frog that was in the water the whole time. You grow up with it. My parents never talked to us really about it. It was just the bombs went off. We hid in the house until the clouds went over. So it wasn't like it was scary. But looking back, I can see that a lot of people were really hurt by it. But yeah, but
Do we have any other questions at all for Jeanne?
I worked at the Nevada test site basically from 1962 to about 1968 for 2 different contractors. And I worked in the radiation sciences department for RICO for about 3 of those years. And I think people were just naive. In the 3 years that I was there, it went from the monitors coming in and saying, oh, we, had these readings, and it went from saying, oh, it's just iodine 131 to, oh my God, it's iodine 131. And so everyone was learning on the fly.
I think a lot of it was learning on the fly. They were really testing, and we were the
I've had people tell me, oh, they knew what they were doing. And I said, I don't think so. I worked for physicists who moved their families to Las Vegas, and they worked at the test site. And I don't think they would knowingly have brought their families to a dangerous area. And I think it was just a learning curve.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings too. Yeah, I don't know that. Well, some of them, when they said it was a communist plot, if you're, a communist inspired plot, and McCarthy was back there doing his thing. I mean, I don't think that helped with the PR much. And I guess then the president wrote a letter, Eisenhower, saying, well, there have to be some people that will have to, we're trying to save the country and protect the country, and some people will have to give their lives to do this. And so that was another letter that came that, okay.
Jeanne, thank you so much for sharing your experiences of growing up at the edge of the Nevada test site. It was so wonderful having you here this afternoon. And everybody, please, again, let's give a round of applause to Jeanne Sharp Howerton.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
And for those of you who are interested, on June 30th, we have our next event. We're going to be doing the Women in Science panel discussion. That's going to be from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Pacific time, here at the museum. It's also going to be available via Zoom. And we're going to be having a panel discussion celebrating women in science. We're going to be having Jill Ruby, the Undersecretary for Nuclear Security and the Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, Dr. Balin Chang, the Senior Weapon Physicist of Los Alamos National Laboratory. We'll also have Raja Mena, the manager of the consequence management out at Nevada National Security Site. We'll also have the moderator, who's Laura M. Tomlinson, the deputy manager of the Nevada Field Office for the National Nuclear Security Administration. So we look forward to having you there or watching remotely. And again, thank you so much, Jeanne, for being here. It was wonderful to have you.
It was fun.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, for your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I can take this off.